History doesn't always unfold in battlefields or parliaments. Sometimes, it happens in rooms where no judge presides, no jury is sworn in, and no verdict is officially read. That's what made this moment so unusual. Because Ukraine didn't walk into Washington as a sovereign nation pleading its case. It walked in like a defendant, convicted before the trial even began. The conviction wasn't written on paper. It was written in body language, in whispers, in the way eyes darted between cameras and backroom doors. The evidence wasn't a dossier, it was Ukraine itself. Its destroyed cities, its drained economy, its desperate plea for survival. And seated across from President Zelensky, Donald Trump wasn't just a political rival plotting a comeback. He became prosecutor, jury, and judge. Only the jury box wasn't filled with peers. It was filled with the invisible gaze of global media, American voters, and foreign leaders watching from afar. And the sentence, no one dared to say it aloud. But the silence said enough. This wasn't a peace talk, it was a trial. And Ukraine was already guilty. The White House had become the courtroom. Not because it bore the scales of justice, but because it carried the weight of decisions that stretched far beyond its walls. Here, justice wasn't measured by fairness, it was measured by leverage. Zelensky entered not as a partner in alliance, but as a man forced to plead his nation's existence. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He spoke of bombed cities, starving children, and the daily terror of Russian missiles. But the room was not built for sympathy. It was built for politics. Every sentence he spoke was measured. Every pause felt like evidence submitted into record. Yet no objections were raised, no interruptions given. Silence hung in the air like a gavel waiting to fall. And then, a whisper shifted everything. A hot mic caught Trump leaning toward Emmanuel Macron. His words, quiet, almost casual, cut deeper than any declaration. Putin wants to make a deal with me. The room stilled. The trial had taken its twist. Because in that one sentence, it became clear, this wasn't about Ukraine's survival. This was about Trump's leverage. His ticket to reclaim power. His promise to end the war not by siding with Ukraine, but by striking a bargain directly with Putin. Suddenly, Zelensky wasn't a leader defending his people. He was a defendant, cross-examined in a trial where the judge had already drafted the verdict. Suspense in the inconsistencies. The contradictions piled up. Publicly, Trump spoke of lasting peace. Privately, his tone was transactional. What's Ukraine really prepared to give up? Can NATO sustain this forever? Would Europe enforce this without us? Each question was less about support, more about testing weaknesses, like a prosecutor searching for holes in a testimony. Zelensky answered, but the room was deaf. Macron smiled faintly. Advisors scribbled notes. Cameras caught fragments, but not the script being played behind closed doors. And in that script, Trump wasn't just questioning, he was sentencing. With every sigh about costs being too high, every line about Europe stepping up, he reshaped himself into the only man who could bring the war to an end. The courtroom without walls had found its judge. But the most damning evidence of all didn't come from cameras. It came from ink on a page. An aide, low-ranking, almost invisible, scribbled notes during the talks. At first, they seemed routine. But when they leaked, the world learned what the courtroom had really been discussing. The notes read, land exchange on the table. Trump insists Putin prefers bilateral deal, not NATO. US aid dependent on concessions. 3 lines. Simple, clinical, but devastating. This wasn't a negotiation. It was coercion. This wasn't peace. It was a transaction. Ukraine wasn't being defended. It was being told what it would lose in exchange for America's continued help. And with those notes, the metaphor of the trial sharpened into something undeniable. Zelensky wasn't pleading for aid. He was bargaining pieces of his country to avoid a sentencing he couldn't stop. Cliffhanger, the unanswered question. So the trial of Ukraine grew darker still. A courtroom with no walls. A judge without a robe. A defendant forced to defend not just its sovereignty, but its very existence. And as the notes leaked, a haunting question echoed across the world. How can a nation survive when its survival is reduced to bargaining chips in someone else's political game? In the next part, the world learns that this wasn't just about Trump, Zelensky, or even Putin. Because hidden inside those notes was the shadow of a larger network, deals, promises, and threats, that would drag other nations into the trial of Ukraine. And once those shadows stepped into the light, the verdict would no longer be about Ukraine alone. It would be about all of us. The leak should have killed the talks. But instead, it electrified them. Cable networks replayed Trump's whisper, "Putin wants to make a deal with me," on a loop. Pundits called it a Freudian slip, others called it treason, and still others hailed it as the only path to peace. But inside the White House, the effect was worse than scandal. It was power. Trump realized his whisper was no accident, it was bait. The world had heard it, and now the world was asking, could Trump actually end the war in a single meeting with Putin? And just like that, the courtroom without walls gained its audience. Not just America, not just Europe, but the entire globe. In the courtroom, allies were supposed to be witnesses. Instead, they were silent. Germany mumbled about continued support. Britain nodded at strategic patience. France avoided the cameras entirely. Each statement was short, clinical, almost rehearsed. But silence is louder than denial. Behind closed doors, European leaders had already started gaming out the possibility of a Trump-brokered deal with Russia. They didn't admit it publicly, but their advisors did. If Trump cuts aid, one German official whispered, Europe cannot fill the gap. We don't have the money. We don't have the will. Answer, the silence of Europe became part of the evidence against Ukraine. Because what does a defendant do when even its own witnesses refuse to testify? The next day, the talks took on a new form. The long oak table in the Roosevelt Room became more than furniture, it became the bargaining table. On it, maps were spread across the polished wood. Lines in red ink divided Ukraine not by rivers or regions, but by zones of compromise. Crimea was circled, the Donbas region shaded. A phrase appeared in Trump's handwriting, temporary occupation equals permanent negotiation leverage. Zelensky's face paled. He had seen many maps in his presidency, but never one where his country was carved up like real estate. This is not negotiation, he said. Trump smiled. This is reality. And in that moment, the bargaining table became the gallows. The turning point came when Trump asked the question no one else dared to voice. If Russia gets what it wants, what do we get? Not we as in the United States. Not we as in NATO. But we as in Trump, as in his campaign, his leverage, his promise to America. Zelensky froze. He had been prepared to plead for aid, for solidarity, even for weapons. But he was not prepared to answer that question. What could Ukraine possibly give that would satisfy the prosecutor? For the first time, the trial wasn't about Ukraine's survival. It was about Trump's reward. The leaked notes had already caused a stir, but what came next was worse. A second set of documents appeared, these not from an aide, but from a European diplomat who had been present in the room. They were sharper, less cautious, almost accusatory. Trump considering sanctions relief in exchange for Russian concessions. Ukraine pressured to accept loss of territory for guarantees of peace. US domestic politics overriding Allied unity. When these notes reached European media, headlines erupted. America trading Ukraine, screamed Berlin. Zelensky under siege in Washington, read London. The trial of Ukraine was no longer hidden. The whole world had entered the courtroom. Trials are shaped by witnesses. And one witness decided to flip. It wasn't a president. It wasn't an ambassador. It was a whistleblower, a mid-level State Department official, furious at the games being played. They released audio, not just whispers, not just notes, full recordings. On the tape, Trump's voice was sharp, transactional. You want aid? Fine, but you're not getting it for free. Russia wants land, I want a deal. You give both of us what we want, or you walk out with nothing. The tape spread like wildfire. News outlets called it the American Yalta. Others labeled it Munich 2.0. But for Ukraine, it was worse than history. It was betrayal caught on tape. The trial of Ukraine now reached its most dangerous stage. The evidence was public. The witnesses had spoken. The maps had been drawn. And yet, no verdict was delivered. Zelensky left Washington not with promises of aid, but with threats of conditions. Trump left not with scandal, but with momentum, hailed by some as the man who could end the war, damned by others as the man willing to sell out democracy. And in between them, the world held its breath. Because the trial was not over. The verdict was pending, and the question was no longer whether Ukraine would lose land, but whether the world itself would lose faith in the very idea of alliances, promises, and justice. And in the shadows, another actor prepared to enter the courtroom, Russia itself, ready to use America's cracks as its strongest weapon yet. If you believe stories like this must be told, stories the headlines will bury, subscribe to the Dark Dossier. Because history isn't just written by the victors. It's also silenced by them.